G'day listeners, Hef here from the Keeper League podcast, bringing you tips for starting an AFL Fantasy Keeper League. Today we're talking about tips for drafting your first Keeper League team. So by now you should have a strategy in mind that you'll be taking into your first Keeper League draft. Whilst you want the draft to be fun and an enjoyable experience, there can be lots of pressure when it comes to picking up players, and your mind will start to race as the draft unfolds. Keeping some of the following considerations in mind will help you when it comes to the big night in picking a strong Keeper League side. The first thing I want to talk about is captain options. So if you're playing with captains on, it's important to get this one right. Your first pick in the draft should be someone you feel comfortable putting the C on every week for the next few years. If you want to look longer term, Clayton Oliver is a standout option as he's only 23 years old and he puts up great fantasy scores each week. However, I wouldn't recommend trying to look more than 3 years into the future because it's just too hard to know what's going to happen in terms of fantasy. And a lot can change between now and then too. Players like Brodie Grundy, Lachie Neale and Jake Lloyd might be entering their late 20s, but they should continue their fantasy scoring for a few years to come. So feel comfortable picking them if you want them. However, you might want to avoid going after some of the older superstars that'll be available in the first round. Players like Max Gawn, Steele Sidebottom or Patrick Dangerfield, as they'll finish their careers a lot sooner than the players mentioned before, and they may decrease their fantasy output between now and then. Keep in mind that depending on your position in the draft though, you might not have a choice and you'll need to take these players, depending on what's available. The next thing I want to talk about is rucks. I think there's two clear standout options when it comes to drafting rucks in Keeper Leagues, and those guys are Brodie Grundy and Riley O'Brien. You could throw Max Gawn in the mix too if you don't mind the fact that he turns 30 this year. He should still score reasonably for the next few years anyway. After these three rucks, there's a major drop-off in class. If you don't get one of these three rucks, I'd advise holding off drafting your rucks until later on in the draft. As most leagues contain around 10 teams and only play one ruck on field, you should be able to find one of the top 10 rucks in the later stages of the draft. If you time it correctly, you could get a young player like Sam Draper or Tom DeConning who have loads of potential going forwards. However, be sure of handcuffing if you do take one of these developing ruckmen. The term handcuffing means picking other rucks who play for the same club who will likely step in if those younger players are dropped, injured or suspended. An example of this would be picking up Andrew Phillips late if you draft Sam Draper early on. Some may disagree with this, but it's important to ensure you draft some decent forwards and backs early on in the draft. Players in these positions seem to fall away a lot quicker than your midfielders do, and you could get caught out if you don't capitalise on them early. It might be tempting to load up on 100 plus averaging midfielders with your first few picks, but you'll probably find yourself scraping the bottom of the barrel when you're trying to find forwards and backs later on. Think about spending some early picks on players like Jack Crisp, Rory Laird and Josh Dunkley to ensure you have a gun player in these positions for years to come. Some younger guns you'll also want to consider are Callum Mills, Braden Maynard and Jordan Ridley. You'll also find there'll be better midfield scorers later on the draft when you compare them to the forwards and backs. So if you do capitalise on forwards and backs early, you can still pick up decent midfielders that'll average 90 to 100 later on in the draft. Another thing to think about is position changes. They're a fact of life and they happen every year, whether you like it or not. But this doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about potential future position changes when drafting your team. While a player might look like good value in your draft, they might be worth a lot less if they lose their forward or defender status. A player like Jai Caldwell is a good example. He's likely to play in the midfield for Essendon despite being listed as a forward this year. If he plays in the midfield all year, he's going to lose his forward status. Now, whether you think he can become a premium scoring midfielder, that's up to you. But if he only averages, say, 80 this year, that's a great score for a forward, but it might not be good compared to the rest of the midfielders. So it might be better to hold off picking players like this and try to get them later in the draft. Thanks for watching my draft tips for another week. Hopefully this will help you in picking a good Keeper League team. Make sure you subscribe to Keeper League Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Good luck, and I'll talk to you soon.